Hello. Thank you so much for joining us today. I looked around about 5 minutes ago and it seemed like the room was half empty, and the next minute I looked around and everyone was gassing away and having a good chat. So, welcome and good morning. My name's Janet Morrison, and I am chair of ACF, and I'm also chair of the Bearing Foundation. So I'm really delighted to be able to welcome all of you as our members of ACF to today's annual conference. As you will all know, ACF is an association, and our strength comes from your strength. So we are here to support, to challenge and inspire you, to help you raise your ambitions, to develop new ideas, to work together and create new collaborations, to think hard about your effectiveness. And our goal is to meet all of your very varied needs and to recognise the diversity of your backgrounds and what you're trying to achieve. And we also work to use your expertise and your knowledge to shape and influence public policy. We have 350 members, and collectively your assets add up to £50 billion. And collectively that means our members spend about 2.5 billion a year. So we have some serious purpose about turning private money into social good and applying it to public purposes. So today we are addressing one of the biggest and most challenging issues of our time. We're going to be thinking about how we together, collectively or individually, can think about the environmental, the economic and the social impacts of climate change. And we're going to think about the causes and consequences, the solutions, whether they're local, national or global. And we're going to think about those related issues, about equity, about risk and about intergenerational justice. So be prepared to get your brains in order, and we've got an amazing lineup of people to talk to you. As part of planning this event, we also thought about how do we plan an event sustainably. So we've done paperless marketing. We've also encouraged you, and I will re-encourage you to engage with the app. We've been flashing up the details there. Go to the App Store and download that app. It's a really good way for you to engage with the agenda, know more about the speakers and the breakout events we've got today, but also to give us your feedback, because that's incredibly helpful. So please do that. When I did it, by the way, when I registered my email, my verification code went into my spam. So just look out for that if you haven't already downloaded it. So, also your badge. Your badge isn't just a badge. Your badge is infused with seeds. So if you take it home tonight, I know you will be doing this as soon as you get home, and you bury it in the garden. Shortly, amongst the many things that will blossom and grow out of today, it might be that you'll have some chrysanthemums or some azaleas to look at as well to remind you of this great day. So we've tried hard to practice what we preach in terms of sustainability. You are here, of course, because you want to network and you want to meet each other. So if you're from a smaller funder and you'd like to meet the smaller funders network, they're collected. They will be in the refreshment area, and you can go and meet the conveners for that. If you're new to ACF, please do introduce yourself to our staff who are here. They can tell you more about how to get involved. Or look out for the trustees. We're wearing black badges. I don't know what that symbolises, but we're more than happy to talk to you about our involvement. And I think you will find, and I hope you will notice, that our trustees are drawn from very different parts of this great sector that we're from, so they can reflect a range of issues for you. So today we've got a fantastic lineup. I will shortly introduce Carol Mack, who's our Chief Executive, who will talk to you, and then we will have Florence Miller from the Environmental Funders Network, who will help chair our plenary session with our great speakers. At lunchtime, there will be the launch of the climate change funding commitment, so please do look out for that and get involved. And obviously we've got lots of breakout sessions, and not that any of you are thinking about alcohol at this moment, but at 4:45 we'll have a reception for us all to reflect on the day and get to know each other further. So that's all from me. Please do get as much as you can out of this. There will be further follow-up activities from ACF afterwards, and please do get involved with us and with Stronger Foundations, where we're trying to drive new thinking and good practice. So that's enough from me. I would like to now introduce Carol Mack, our Chief Executive, who will start us off for the day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome to this conference. Just one item of housekeeping. If there's a fire alarm, it's real. There aren't any practices planned. Follow the exit signs, and we'll all meet in the courtyard outside. So, welcome to this conference. It's fantastic to see so many of you here this morning. I'm sure it won't have escaped your notice that as we meet here today, our country is preparing for an election like no other. This is a significant moment, and one that poses considerable uncertainty about the future. As leaders within civil society, we've been grappling with political uncertainties for a long time now. Yet despite this, our latest Foundation Giving Trends research shows that funding levels have been robust, and many of you are offering thoughtful responses to the challenges of our time. We could have dedicated this whole conference to Brexit or the political outlook. But as important as these events are for our country, they're not taking place in a vacuum. They coincide with a moment of even greater global significance. A climate crisis is brewing that will affect all nations and all people unless urgent, concerted action is taken. It threatens many people's lives directly and the quality of all our lives within only a few decades. And it's expected to have the greatest impact on those who are marginalized in our society. We had enormous interest from ACF members in attending this conference, with dozens of colleagues on a waiting list. For me, this confirms that this is the right time for us to take a broader global view. It's time for us to consider why the changing climate is going to be one of the lenses through which we all have to view our work. And I'd like to help us start to think about this today. So, to begin, what do we mean by climate change? And why has it now taken on the mantle of a full-blown climate crisis? Many of us in this room started our careers before climate change was widely recognized as the pressing concern that it is today. I feel a little embarrassed to say that I started my own career in the oil and gas sector. I wanted to share this with you because I want to surface that many of us feel enmeshed in this issue. To some extent, all of us living in industrialized nations are implicated in climate change. I think it's better to recognize this up front rather than avoid it. It's okay to acknowledge that our awareness has grown over time. If we haven't taken action in the past, this doesn't mean we can't act now. One reason we're all better informed today is the overwhelming global scientific consensus that has been established. The work of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been critical in this. This group of scientists from around the world has spent the last 30 years reviewing and narrating the evidence on climate change. And if we pause just for a moment to consider their key findings, it may be helpful to focus all of our minds on the enormity of the issue at hand. Put very simply, global warming is caused by greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. This graph shows the level of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere over the past 800,000 years. We often say foundations have a long time horizon, but nothing like that. You can't see the detail, I'm sure, but what you can see is that over the past 100 years or so, we've broken a long-established pattern and begun moving dramatically off the scale. The scientists' best estimate is that the planet's average temperature has already risen by more than 1 degree C since pre-industrial times as a result. The correlation with that graph is astounding. On current forecasts, the scientists expect the temperature to rise half as much again by some point between the 2030s and 2050s. So our planet will be 1.5 degrees C warmer by the time a child born today can expect to start secondary school. And though these temperatures sound like small numbers, the consequences are not small. We're already seeing the start of this on the news. Heat waves, melting glaciers, rising sea levels, increased flooding, wildfires, water scarcity, the list goes on. These impacts have long been predicted, but now we can increasingly see for ourselves what they mean and what the implications are for us, our human species living on this unique planet. Not only are the consequences not small, they're not evenly distributed. By and large, the people that have been the biggest contributors to climate change are not the ones who are most adversely affected by it. Those who are most impacted tend to be the most vulnerable in our society. In 2015, world leaders stated their ambition to limit global warming to 2 degrees C by the end of the century. But at this 2 degrees C level, the consequences of climate change are dire, with hundreds of millions more people directly affected. It's a sign of how far down this path we've already travelled that this is considered an acceptable goal, the least worst outcome that's plausible now. But even this is beginning to look extremely challenging. The scientists say that without swift action, we are more likely on a path to a rise of 3 degrees C or more by the end of the century. That's when a baby born today will be 81 years old. These changes are expected to take effect within the lifetimes of our children and our grandchildren. So it's perhaps no wonder so many of them are going on strike or lying down in our streets. It is deeply disturbing. I want to turn to why this climate crisis is relevant for individual foundations. For some of you, this may seem clear-cut. We cannot go on assuming business as usual. Yet I know that some of you are asking whether the climate crisis is a legitimate consideration for your foundation in the here and now, given its specific charitable objectives and time horizons. And I want to spend some time exploring this. The first and most important thing to consider is charity law. The law says that charity trustees can use their discretion in determining how best to achieve their charitable objectives. The foundations you represent here in this room have an incredibly diverse range of charitable purposes. Most of them were set down many years ago. Some predate the Industrial Revolution. They were not formed with the climate crisis in mind. But now that we are aware of the scale and scope of climate change, it's surely possible for trustees to consider its impact upon their charitable objectives, whatever those may be. Because the climate crisis raises important questions for all foundations, whatever their area of interest. For example, as I've already alluded to, there are clear links between poverty, inequality, human rights, and climate change. And our panellists will be saying more about this in a few minutes. But let's take some other examples. For foundations that fund in a particular place, some of your questions might be, who will be most vulnerable to extremes of weather in my patch? What are the specific risks in my area? Coastal erosion? Deforestation? Flooding? What are the opportunities in terms of the built environment, conservation, developing renewable energy projects? How can I help my community to have its voice on climate change heard? How can I build a coalition for positive environmental and social action? Foundations are already asking themselves these questions, and some are already called into action, like the Cumbria Community Foundation response to unprecedented flooding in that county. Foundations who are concerned about health are asking about the overlaps between climate change and tackling health inequalities. If we think about severe weather events affecting older and more vulnerable people, for example, or impacting on mental health, and given that these are increasing in frequency, what more could we do to boost the resilience of people and the health systems that support them? For funders of the arts, museums and heritage, there's a growing awareness of the challenge that climate change poses to physical artifacts, the natural environment, and intangible cultural heritage. How can we preserve what we hold dear in the light of unprecedented change? What role can the arts play in moving the discourse away from individual resignation and towards one of collective resolve? In short, it is possible for any foundation to make a legitimate connection to their charitable objectives. What does that mean in practice? Well, at a minimum, maybe it means doing no harm. It might mean thinking about making your own operations greener and perhaps supporting your grantees to reduce their carbon footprint. Many foundations are going much further. They're asking how they can shift more of their funding, their investments, and use all of their assets to help tackle the climate crisis. Wherever you lie on that spectrum, I think it is possible for all foundations to use climate as one of the lenses they bring to thinking about their work. In fact, I'd go further and say, given the scientific forecasts, it's highly advisable for all to consider what it will mean for beneficiaries now and in the future. Because to be fair to the future, we need to change now. Beyond our individual foundations, I believe the climate crisis has implications for the foundation sector as a whole. Probably the biggest story in global philanthropy in the last year was the debate waged after the Notre Dame fire. Wealthy donors stepped forward pledging to rebuild the cathedral. At first, their gifts attracted praise, but this soon turned to criticism. In Paris, homeless people are sleeping under its famous bridges. Where is the urgency from philanthropy? When fires rage in the Amazon, where is the urgency? As Greta Thunberg said, where is the cathedral thinking when it comes to the climate crisis? The best available data suggests that only a small fraction of philanthropic funding in the UK is currently focused on climate change. Given the twin trends of growing climate awareness and falling trust in many institutions, it seems inevitable that institutional philanthropy will face more scrutiny over its choices in the coming years. If the world faces an imminent climate crisis, do foundations have their heads in the sand? Are we ignoring the 68 billion elephants in the room? Are 68 billion pounds worth of endowments, a significant portion of which are invested in a financial system that is harming our environment and exacerbating inequality? Have we really thought about what it means to fund on a finite planet? These are really challenging questions for the foundation sector. Yet I believe we are already equipped with some of the answers. One of the most celebrated hallmarks of foundations is that they're able to take a long-term view. Many of us are here because our predecessors did this. They acted to ensure their organisations existed to meet the needs of future generations as well as present ones. Yet the facts about climate change may urge us to reconsider how we do this. What does it mean to exist in perpetuity if we know that inaction now could render the future unbearable? If we know that harm is being done now that cannot be undone in the future? Another way of looking at the gift of longevity is that we also have the freedom to change our horizons, to consider taking more action in the here and now to preserve the future. In the light of what we now know, I think this is something that all boards could at least be considering. We have the opportunity to change our horizons. We can think again about what the long term means. Foundations are also well known for supporting pluralism. They fund many different causes, different interventions, and different approaches. They can take risks. They can support minority viewpoints. Remember, that's what environmentalism once was. And they can support multiple strands of innovation. But with a more imminent climate crisis in mind, will 1,000 flowers always be able to bloom? A less well-celebrated feature of foundations is our freedom to collaborate and to coordinate where we choose to. Taken together, our limited resources may have greater impact. Pluralism has its merits, but in the face of the climate crisis, so does collective action. So we have the opportunity to pull together, not just play our own part. Finally, what I think many of us would say is the greatest strength of foundations: their independence. Foundations have always had the freedom to make their own choices and to complement their actions with their voices where appropriate. Yet as we look through a climate lens, I can't help but wonder if our independence can also be an easy way out. Our lack of direct accountability to those we serve, especially the generations to come, has sometimes enabled us to stay below the parapet when we ought to have taken the lead and been the first over it. as foundations, we have the opportunity to look again at how we use all of our resources in the light of this climate challenge, to think about the privilege of our independence and what we're doing with it, to think about how we can use our voices and lift up others' voices at this critical time. Does our independence and ability to take both short and long-term risks actually give us unique advantages in addressing these concerns? It's always the case that as Chief Executive of ACF, I want to champion foundations. I want foundations to be the best enablers we can be of social good and civic life. I want foundations to be seen in their best light, and I want them to be in a position to welcome public scrutiny. And I've spent the first 3 years of my tenure in this role focusing on how we can equip and support our members to do this through our Stronger Foundations initiative, which many of you are involved in, and which is examining what it means to be an ambitious and effective foundation. Increasingly, being effective in the pursuit of social good will mean taking a climate lens to our work. At ACF, we believe the climate crisis is real. It is serious. And all foundations should be intentional about their response. Whether it's thinking about setting your strategies, discussing your investments, or future funding plans. Because if we prevaricate or fail to listen to the urgent concerns of young people here and across the world, I fear we could find ourselves on the wrong side of history when it comes to the climate crisis. I know that as funders you are already having these conversations, and I sincerely hope that today's conference can add positively to that discussion. As your membership association, both I and my team are committed to holding and protecting the space to enable you to come together and share with your peers. Because regardless of the challenges we face, I strongly believe we meet them best when we meet them together. So I'd like to end my comments today with an opportunity for those of you who are inspired to take action. I'm very pleased that, as Janet mentioned, today sees the launch of a new funder commitment on climate change, which has been developed by ACF members. It provides a clear statement for all foundations that are ready to sign up and take action, and it's also a guide for those who are willing to make a start and looking for some direction. At ACF, we fully support this commitment. Over the next few months, we'll work with those who've spearheaded this effort to inform members about it and hopefully build the community of practice around it. Like all change, it starts with people and with leadership. Leadership doesn't always have to come from the top. I hope it will come from all of you who are here today. Thank you and enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Carol. That was a fantastic speech. And hello to all of you, and thank you to the ACF for inviting me to be here. I'm Florence Miller. I run the Environmental Funders Network, which started out its life as an ACF network many years ago. So I'm absolutely delighted to have been asked to come and chair this plenary session. But I must say, I feel that having the Environmental Funders Network here is a bit of a red herring, or possibly that our network is just really poorly named. And that's because the climate crisis, as Carol has so eloquently alluded to, is not really an environmental issue. In fact, it could not be much more a human issue. It's caused by humans, It profoundly affects humans, as well, of course, as our fellow creatures on this planet. And crucially, and I know our speakers will be talking about this, it dramatically exacerbates the fault lines that already exist in society, with a really disproportionate impact on those who already find themselves, through systemic structural inequalities, to be at a disadvantage. So we face this gargantuan societal challenge, one that affects almost any issue that you might care about. And yet foundations have been very slow to take up the mantle. We conduct research that tracks grants to environmental issues. And until quite recently, only about £35 million per year were going from UK foundations to address climate change. That's just a drop in the bucket compared to the scale of the challenge. By way of comparison, that 35 million compares to £12 billion a year in fossil fuel subsidies from the UK government. But we're seeing this start to shift as more and more funders begin to join the dots between what they care about most and the crisis. That's from the very large foundations, from the Wellcome Trust, which now has an Our Planet, Our Health programme, for example, which I think is represented here today, to many small family foundations, such as the Savitri Waini Charitable Trust, which participates in EFN. They had been funding cataract surgery in rural India for many years, and they still do. But having focused on these rural communities for so long, they began to realize the profound impact that climate change was having on them. And they realized that the time had come to put much more energy and resources into this crisis. So I think it's no longer possible to address many philanthropic concerns without also addressing climate change. And as far as we can tell, the majority of you agree with that in some way. So you will have seen that ACF sent out a survey before the conference, and over 80 of you responded to it. And of those 80, over 91% agreed that climate change was related to your mission, your foundation's work in some way. But 2/3 of you said that you lacked a full level of confidence in explaining what that connection was. So we're all hoping that today, this morning's plenary and all the breakout sessions in the afternoon will really help everyone come to better grips with how climate change intersects with your foundation's mission, whatever that may be, and what that means for your work. So in a moment, I'm going to hand the floor to our three speakers. You'll see that there are only two present. Majandra is going to join us, but the UK government did not get her visa in time, which, as you might imagine, was incredibly stressful for her. So she has pre-recorded her speech, but she is here and listening and will be joining us for the question and answer session, assuming the internet connection works for that. So we have Kumi Naidoo, General Secretary of Amnesty International, Miatta Fahnbulleh, who's the Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation, and Majandra Rodriguez Acha, who I mentioned is joining us virtually, who's the Co-Executive Director of FRIDA, the Young Feminist Fund. And I'm really grateful to all of you for being here. But before that, you will have seen on your chairs, you had these clever little digi-voting boxes when you arrived. And we thought that given that we have so many trusts and foundations under one roof, in one place, it would be great to see, for everyone, what your peers are thinking when it comes to the global climate challenge, and to give some context to the plenary discussion and to help our panelists see where you're coming from. So let's see if you can make these things work. Alistair, if we could have the first question. So all you need to do is press the button. This is just a practice one. There's no judgment here. We will not judge how you arrived at the conference. Full credit if you arrived on a pogo stick. Okay, if we could see the answer now. Thank you, Alistair. So most of you came, not surprisingly, by tube or train. Right, so we'll go to the first serious question. So the external environment, needless to say, often plays a role in how foundations create their strategies and how they decide what to spend their resources on. So could you let us know what you see as the most pressing external issue facing you as a foundation on this list? Great. Alistair, if you could show us the answer, please. So the level of societal need is by far the most pressing issue, which is interesting because last year actually it was technological change, although yes, that's very low this year, which is really quite surprising, isn't it? Last year that was nearly a third, with economic uncertainty and declining trust, which is also very low this year. So there's been quite a substantial change. We did not expect, by the way, that climate change would magically be the most pressing issue affecting your foundation. But I think it's quite telling that ACF did not include climate change last year. I mean, in the last year, we've seen such a sea change in public concern, and that has trickled through to foundations. Okay, so Alistair, the next question, please. This is around what you feel about taking action on climate change within your foundation, and I'll give you a slightly longer to answer this one. Great. So Alistair, if we could see the answer, please. So gosh, over a third of you are already starting to have conversations about the climate crisis in your foundations. I think that's really remarkable, actually, and I hope that today will help you move even further forwards on that. I do think this is a good moment. You may have heard about the app that is being used for the conference today. There's a report on there that the philanthropy advisory consultancy 10 Years' Time have just released called Climate Change and Social Change. And I do really encourage you to have a look at that. It's about how funders can act on both social change and climate change at once. And I think it does a really excellent job of joining the dots between any number of issues that may be of concern to your foundation and climate change. So it talks about the connections between poverty, inequality, young people, health, heritage, and so on. So I do encourage you to take a look at that to inform your conversations within your foundations. Great, so the next question, please. So which of the tools at your disposal do you think pose the greatest opportunity for your foundation to address climate change? Great, if we could see the answers now, please, Alistair. So nearly half of you think your investments are the most powerful tool. And I think it's unavoidable that probably the greatest impact you have on climate change as a foundation is through your investments. So I hope many of you will be attending the breakout sessions this afternoon. There are a couple of different sessions at least on investments and climate change. So, and of course there are others on grant making, such as the one I will shamelessly plug with Eva Racer from the Global Green Grants Fund this afternoon. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Each of them has prepared a short talk, and after they've spoken, I'm going to be asking you to turn to your neighbours to discuss for a few minutes what struck you most about what you heard, both from their talks but also from Carol's excellent speech this morning. And after that, then we'll have a sort of full room plenary discussion. So do have your questions at the ready. So may I please introduce Kumi Naidoo, who's Secretary General of Amnesty International, a lifelong social justice and environmental campaigner. So I will give you a full introduction, Kumi, so that everyone is fully briefed. Kumi hails from South Africa. He was born in Durban in 1965, and at age 15, he organised and took part in an anti-apartheid protest that got him expelled from school. He was forced to live in exile, so not only was he expelled from school, but he was forced to live in exile as a result of his continued anti-apartheid activism. So he moved to the UK in 1986, and he lived here for 4 years. But he returned to South Africa in 1990 to work with the ANC, and he went on to hold multiple leadership roles in civil society and global organisations, including most recently as Executive Director of Greenpeace. He joined Amnesty International as the organisation's 9th Secretary General in August 2018. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Florence. Good morning, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear brothers and sisters. Let me just start by saying I have no illusions why I was invited to be part of this opening plenary. I'm simply here for gender balance. The second thing I would like to say is that I'm reminded of a moment from the South African anti-apartheid struggle. If you followed a presentation like what you heard from Carol and what you've just heard from Florence, you started by saying, most of the really good points I wanted to make have been eloquently made by the previous speakers, and then you said, however, for emphasis, and you spoke for about 1 hour. I've got a few minutes, so let me just say that These days, when I stand up before an audience, I'm much more nervous than I was as a 15-year-old activist. And the reason for that is best put in a story. Speaking to a group of philanthropists in the United States, talking about the convergence of crisis that we face in the world today, in the Q&A, a woman put up a hand and said, "Dr. Naidoo, have you heard of Martin Luther King?" I said, "Yes, he deeply inspired me and many people in my country in the fight against apartheid." And then she said, "Do you know what his most famous speech was called?" Thinking it was a trick question, I answered very gently saying, "I have a dream." And she shouted back, "Yes, it was I have a dream, but when I hear you speak, it sounds like you have a nightmare." Right? And therein lies one of the leadership challenges of the moment we find ourselves in. We have to speak honestly about how deep the crisis we face right now, but we also have to do it in a way that motivates, inspires, encourages people to actually get involved. We cannot, and I've been saying recently, the paralysis of our analysis can only be overcome by the optimism of our action. And that is the moment we find ourselves in. Mary Robinson these days says 3 important things to know about climate. First, it's much worse than we think it is. Second, it's getting worse much faster than we think it's happening. And third, we have the solutions if only we can mobilize political will to actually act, even in a window of opportunity that is small and fast closing. What is the connection then between human rights and climate? For Amnesty International, whether we chose, as we did several years ago, to work on climate's fingerprints are firmly on many aspects of our work. Right to food, right to water, right to land, indigenous people's rights, rights of refugees and migrants. All of these issues have now a major climate impact. Mary Robinson talks about climate justice, and our speakers have already opened the door to that question. It is a terrible, terrible injustice that the people that live the lowest consumptive lifestyles are the ones that are paying the first and most brutal impacts of climate change. The UN Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty and Inequality, Philip Alston, talks about climate apartheid, where essentially, if you look at which parts of the world contributed most to the problem to date and which parts of the world are actually paying the first price, it creates a very uncomfortable demographic picture, and therefore the term climate apartheid is actually very relevant as well. But climate change constitutes the biggest intergenerational human rights violations because essentially our current generation of adult political and business leaders are completely betraying the future of our children and so on. And as I look at your audience and I see some of your expressions have got a little more sort of sadder as I've been talking, let me just say that I have some good news. And the good news is this. People like myself at some point have said, save the planet, save the climate, save the environment. The good news is the planet is fine. The planet actually does not need saving. If we continue on the suicidal trajectory that we are on, the end result is we will be gone, the planet will still be here. And the good news is, once we become extinct as a species, the forests will recover, the oceans will replenish, everything will be recovered. So let's understand the struggle to avert catastrophic climate change is nothing more or nothing less than making a commitment that we want to protect our children and their children's futures. And irrespective of religion, irrespective of North and South, irrespective of culture, all our societies around the world claim to be concerned and supportive of our children. And let me just say that we are betraying our children right now, left, right, and center. And our children are speaking with the most eloquence that the situation calls for. The best slogans on climate change are coming from our young people. Yeah, on the streets of London, when I marched with them several months ago, as we marched past Downing Street, 2 young girls picked up a sign saying, "You can get better cabinets at IKEA." And my other favorite one was, Two 12-year-olds, I went and spoke to them, were carrying a sign saying, "Keep Earth clean, it's not Uranus." By the way, I tried that in Germany, it didn't work in translation. But the saddest sign that I saw in New York recently was two young girls carrying a sign saying, "Sorry, Mom, I don't think you're going to be a grandma." It is unacceptable that we have allowed our children to be placed under such severe pressure. It is unacceptable that our children are actually behaving like the adults should be behaving. As Greta Thunberg says, our parents tell us, don't play with fire when we are growing up. And now our whole home is burning, and our parents are letting political and business leaders get away with business as usual approaches when business as usual approaches are just not good enough. So I want to just put the 1.5 figure in context, because one of the main weaknesses in the climate movement has been the climate movement, in the sense that we talk in ways that are inaccessible, we talk in parts per million, degrees, and so on. So we have to start speaking like human beings, as ordinary people would understand. But I just want to deconstruct the 1.5 because it is quite important. Essentially, it's saying from the time that we started burning carbon, we cannot warm up beyond 1.5. As Carol pointed out, we are at 1.1 already, right? And at 1.1, in the last decade, we've had more than 100% increase in extreme weather events. And the science doesn't know with certainty that when we move to 1.2, is it going to double? Is it going to quadruple? Is it going to increase by 10%? And then when we go to 1.3, and so on. In July 2015, I was in the Pacific, and I learned a new slogan. It went like this: 1.5 to stay alive. 1.5 to stay alive. These are what people in the most vulnerable places are talking about. And 6 months later, I meet them at the Paris climate negotiations, and they pull me to come and speak at a little protest in front of the negotiators, and I was proudly about to start chanting the slogan they taught me 6 months earlier. And they say, "So, the slogan has changed." So I say, "What's the new slogan?" And they say, 1.5, we might survive. 1.5, we might survive. So, my dear friends, for philanthropy, the first thing you have to consider seriously and urgently, if foundations currently have investments in fossil fuels, in other climate-destroying economic initiatives that, for example, drive deforestation, you need to have the fastest plan to divest from those sectors that are driving humanity to extinction. Secondly, you can be proactive and drive investments. Now, I'm not talking about your philanthropic investments, and I was very encouraged by that answer to one of the. So, essentially invest more in the solutions that are necessary. Let me conclude by saying that you have a simple choice here. You either engage in courageous, creative philanthropy, or you engage in what I call philanthropy, F-O-O-L, where we actually kid ourselves that we're actually addressing the root causes and the systemic reasons behind the injustice that we face, or we actually say that we need to understand that what's needed is not rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic while humanity sinks, but what is needed is deep, structural, systemic change that builds a different kind of economy, a different kind of agricultural system, a different kind of energy system, and different consumption patterns, and much more. So to end, I say, we have to recognize nature does not negotiate. We cannot change the science. All that we have within our capability is to change political will, and the good news is the political will is a renewable source. Unfortunately, sometimes you don't have that many great options. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kumi. And those final words about rebuilding a new economy that serves us better are perfect as we transition to Miatta Fahnbulleh, who's Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation. Miatta has a wealth of experience in developing and delivering policy to empower communities and change people's lives. She's been at the forefront of generating new ideas on reshaping our economy, both from within inside the government and out. Prior to joining NEF, she was Director of Policy and Research at IPPR, the Institute for Public Policy Research. And before that, she worked at senior levels for the Leader of the Opposition, the Cabinet Office, and the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. Her work has included the development of policies from devolution to local economic growth, housing, energy, climate change and transport, driving forward the government's economic devolution agenda in England, and localism and local economic growth. Miatta has both a master's and a PhD in economic development from the London School of Economics and a BA in PPE from Oxford. Thank you, Miatta.
Good morning. I'm absolutely delighted to be here discussing this fundamental and critical issue. And for me, it's incredible that climate change has muscled its way back onto the political agenda, with, quite frankly, credit to the sheer grit, determination, willpower of activists, campaigners, and a generation of young people that have demanded that their voices be heard. And it's amazing that the idea of a Green New Deal, an idea that came from organizations including the New Economics Foundation a decade ago, has emerged as a key demand to the climate emergency. The idea is simple: an unprecedented mobilization of resources of the sort we have never achieved in peacetime to decarbonize the economy at pace whilst creating hundreds of thousands of good jobs and lifting living standards across the country. But at its heart is a recognition that climate change and the wider threat to our environment is a symptom of an economic system that is broken. The same economic system that is failing millions of people across the country, millions of people across the globe. And so to tackle climate change, we must transform the economy, and we should do this in a way that works for the majority of people. This means an end to making incremental changes to the status quo and tinkering around the margins, and time for quite fundamental and radical change in the way that our economy works. Now, look, some people will hear this and say, look, this is pie in the sky thinking it won't happen. And we say the conditions for such change are taking root. And this is being driven by the scale of the environmental crisis and the economic breakdown that we are seeing. So we all know we're in a climate emergency. We've been told by the experts that we have little over a decade to take drastic action to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. And it's not just the threat of climate change. It's the fact that we are depleting our natural resources at 1.5 times its ability to regenerate. This year, the UN warned that our nature is declining at a rate that is unprecedented in human history. 1 million species are now at risk of mass extinction. By 2025, 2/3 of the world population could be living under water stress conditions. At the rate that we are degrading topsoil, we may only have 60 harvests left. This is not just an environmental threat. It is the biggest threat to social justice and economic justice that we will face. So, this is scary stuff, and it is often put in the too hard or too scary to think about box. But we are going to be shaken out of our environmental complacency, whether we are ready or not, as this begins to bite on people's day-to-day lives, as it's already doing across the globe in a really visceral way. Now, this environmental tipping point is coming at the same time as we're having to confront deep structural problems with our economy. First amongst this is the fact that the economy isn't working for everyone, something there is growing political consensus for in this country. Over the last decade, we have seen that the economy has grown but the benefits of this have not been shared by huge swathes of our society. We've had a decade of stagnating wages, hitting those on low and middle income the hardest. People have been squeezed as the cost of essential things they rely on, housing, energy, transport, has grown. So living standards in this country today are lower than they were in 2008. We have 14 million people in this country living in poverty. We have 1 in 3 of our children living in poverty, despite the fact that 70% of them are coming from families who are working. We're seeing rising inequality, so 10% of households now own 48% of this country's wealth, whilst the bottom 50% just own 9%. My take on this sort of inequality, it is endemic in the current economic system. But I think people were willing to suck it up. People were willing to tolerate it as long as they were doing incrementally better from the system. As soon as this breaks down in the way that we have seen over the last 10 years, I think the public's tolerance for this sort of inequality hits a buffer in a way that starts to fundamentally question the very model and the very system. So the environmental and the economic are coming together in quite a profound way that will force us to think about the nature of our economy, how it works, and in whose interest it works, opening up public appetite and public consent for radical change of the sort that we're talking about through a Green New Deal. But to be transformative, a Green New Deal for the UK, and there's a question about a Green New Deal that must be applied in other countries, but it's got to be ambitious, with a stretching target for meeting net zero sooner than 2050, and with the heavy lifting on decarbonisation happening in the next 10 to 15 years. Private investment will be absolutely key to this, and we're already seeing positive moves, but we're going to have to go much further and faster. And here, there is a really important role for investors and philanthropic investors, shifting from brown, dirty investment that's perpetuating this carbon-intensive economy to cleaner, greener investment. And while some of this will happen organically, as markets begin to clock that actually the inherent risk implicit in fossil-intensive activities that will have to die out, they will have to die out if we are to respond to climate change. So we will see a shift, but the pace and the urgency of this shift will not be enough unless there is a push through packages of regulation and incentives from governments that are trying to respond to the climate imperative. But we're clear that this on its own is not going to be enough. We won't achieve the pace or the scale of change that we need to see without large-scale public investment in green infrastructure, in technology, and the skills that we need to transition. But this investment has got to be deployed in ways that will deliver a better deal for the public. It must be used to create better jobs, to replace the ones that will come to an end as we end the use of fossil fuels. And the green economy that emerges has to be owned by people. It has to work in their interest. So this means common ownership of green infrastructure and assets we will invest in, from renewable energy to public transport to fleets of electric cars. It means more cooperative ways of organizing new industries that will spring up, from cooperative insulation companies to community energy companies. Get this right, and we may just not only respond to the environmental challenge, but radically transform our economy so it works for people and planet. It is within our grasp, but it won't happen unless the growing movement continues to apply pressure for radical change, bridging divides from left to right, from old to young, forcing our politics to confront the scale of the challenge we face and to step up in response, changing the very system in turn. And here there is a critical role for you to play as funders of civil society, to think about funding activities that are designed to change the system and how it is shaping people's lives, rather than, though important as it is, funding activities which provide a temporary alleviation to the negative consequences of the system, but not fundamentally looking to change it. There is a role for you in investing in the things that builds the capacity of people and communities to organize, to come together with different ways of doing things that will work for people and planet, and to mobilize as a movement in order to exert power for wider change. This is the difference between funding specific time-limited projects or initiatives to investing in backbone organizations, to investing in community infrastructure, institutions and processes that will drive change. And this will require strategic coordination, collaboration across funders. The scale of the challenge is too big for it not to be bigger than the sum of their parts. This means long-term funding of change where funders see themselves as part of a partnership with other players on the ground, asking the critical question of how do we achieve urgent green transition that can improve living standards of people and communities across the country. We know there is huge energy, innovation, appetite for change, but there is a desperate need for long-term, flexible funding to enable this change and to build the movement that will be absolutely critical to building power and pressure to change the system. Thank you.
Thank you, Miatta. So finally, I'm very pleased to introduce, although she's not here with us directly, Majandra Rodriguez Acha. And as I mentioned before, her speech is pre-recorded, but she is listening. Majandra is a climate justice and feminist activist from Peru, based in Lima, though she's joining us from Barcelona today. Majandra is the co-founder of Tierra Activa Peru, a national network that strengthens the youth climate movement through collective action towards systemic change. In 2016, Majandra was Young Feminist Fellow for Climate Justice at the Women's Environment and Development Organization, WEDO, and FRIDA, promoting the visibility and engagement of young women and young feminists in climate advocacy. She worked most recently at Oxfam in Peru as Program Officer for Fiscal Justice and Active Citizenship Against Inequality, where she supported social and political campaigns and projects. She's currently a member of the Next Generation Climate Board at Global Green Grants Fund, and she's just been appointed as new co-executive director of FRIDA, the Young Feminist Fund, where she was a member of the board for the last 2 years.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Majandra Rodriguez, and I'm from Lima, Peru, and that's part of the reason why I'm unfortunately not able to be there in person with you today, because what passport you hold unfortunately determines how easily or how fast you can enter the UK or not. And if you'll excuse me, I'll read from some notes that I have just to make sure that I stick to the 7-minute mark. But of course, my visa woes are not significant at all in relation to the severe need and the numbers of people who seek to enter the UK every day looking for refuge, for safety, and for reuniting with their loved ones. And this is of course not unrelated to the climate crisis, as we're seeing natural disasters increasing in frequency and intensity, and as we're seeing competition and tensions heightened due to increasingly scarce, vital common goods such as water, which are necessary for survival in the global south and throughout the world. And this reality is intersecting with ethno-nationalist fervors that are rising, tensions, growing populism in the UK and throughout the world, connected to rising fundamentalisms and open racism and hatred, oftentimes condoned by those in political power. In other words, this is compounding existing inequalities, and it's not a coincidence that the black and brown bodies that are being turned away from borders are also the ones most impacted by the climate crisis. And this leads me to one of the main points that I wanted to transmit today, which is that while the climate crisis affects all of us, it does affect some of us more than others. And any action to address it must therefore center justice in order to be effective, in order to be sustainable in the long term, and in order to have real impact. And as I'm sure the speakers before me have shared, the climate crisis is really a systemic crisis. It's the crisis of an entire system, of an entire way of life, of an economic, political, social, cultural system that is based upon the extraction of so-called natural resources or common goods and on the exploitation of people. And these two go hand in hand. That is, the current excessive, unceasing extraction would not be possible without the sacrifice of the bodies and the well-being and the very lives of some. I was recently at the Aini Climático, which was a climate camp in Chile of climate justice activists, environmental activists from throughout Latin America. And I learned there about sacrifice zones. Chile currently has 5 sacrifice zones recognized by human rights bodies there. And in one of these sacrifice zones, which is located in Valparaíso, there are 15 large-scale industries, including copper mining, chemical industries, and fossil fuel industries, in a single region, right? So a few years back, an entire school there had to be relocated due to the mass intoxication of school children. And a few years ago, oil spills impacted local beaches. And this is an entire region that is being sacrificed so that business as usual can continue to operate and to maintain the economic systems that others are benefiting from, others across the world or in Chile itself. These sacrifice zones are areas of the world, populations of the world, where landfills can be built, where runoff can be openly released into the local water sources, where industries can be located, with heavy metals polluting the air and polluting the soil, and those in political and economic power will not intervene, because that would mean curtailing the industries that fuel so-called growth and development, and because those in political and economic power don't live in these parts of the world. And so this is happening in the global south, but it is also happening in communities in the global north, where again, those who are being most impacted by what they did not cause are Black and brown bodies, are working class communities, are women living in rural areas, for example, are the most vulnerable populations, folks living with disabilities, trans youth who are homeless or living on the streets because their families aren't, have kicked them out. So as a fellow climate activist, Nathan Thankey stated in an article quite recently, if we do nothing about this, we are essentially saying that preserving a certain lifestyle or current business as usual is more valuable to us, is more important to us than the lives of millions of people throughout the world. So what is the role of philanthropy in all of this? And that is why we're here today, to answer this question. Philanthropy and charity really can exist because of inequality, because excess wealth was able to be accumulated historically and is being accumulated in this very moment, oftentimes in connection to these very same extractive industries. And of course, the mission of many charitable foundations is to redistribute that wealth. However, as those of us in participatory grant-making organizations such as FRIDA, the Young Feminist Fund, where I work, ask ourselves, how can we redistribute not just the resources, but also the power that comes along with those resources, recognizing these historical and structural inequalities that some have benefited from? So to do this, we really need to be centering the voices, the priorities, and the needs of communities most impacted, their infinite expertise, and recognize and center their wisdom. As of a few years ago, I read in a report that the percentage of environmental grants going towards the grassroots was just 3%. And even if this percentage has grown in recent years, it is really nowhere close to where it needs to be. And small injections of funding into grassroots communities, grassroots organizations has been and is incredibly effective, as these communities know best what they need in their local context and know best the needs of their movements. They are experts of their own struggles and experts of their own reality. Movements are on the front lines of impacts and are also on the front lines of change. And supporting them means really learning how to step back and to make space for their leadership. It means engaging them and centering their voices and their perspectives. And it really means envisioning a world where philanthropy does not need to exist and cannot exist because inequality does not exist. And it means working towards that vision. And for this, we need funding that has no strings attached, that is really in service of movements and not of donor-driven agendas or red tapes and bureaucracies. And this is not easy. It entails having difficult, sometimes uncomfortable conversations. It means being brave, and it means thinking outside the box. And most importantly, it means coming to work together to really confront this crisis. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions and your comments.
Thank you, Majandra. And I know you're listening and you probably feel at a disadvantage not being here, but you have a certain godlike quality because we can't see you when we know you're there. So I think what we'll do now is just have 5 minutes to turn to your neighbour and just discuss what you've heard, what came up for you, ask any questions of each other, and then at the end of that I'll wrap it up and we'll have a sort of a normal plenary session where you can ask questions. Ready to start the discussion? Can I have your attention? Great, lovely to see so much energy in the room. That is fantastic. So I'd like to open it up really for questions for the speakers. As you can see, Majandra has joined us. I can't see what you can see. Majandra, anyway, so hopefully she can see you. So any questions from the audience or comments? We've got roving mics. Can you start with there's a red, right behind Simon there, there's a hand up with a red jumper, thank you. And then we'll go to over here, Hitan, who had his hand up.
Hello, my name's Jo Baker from Local Trust. We're a funder in England. Majandra, I'd love it if you could speak a little bit more to unpaid labour, particularly from a feminist perspective, and what funders might be able to do in that arena. Thank you.
Did you hear that, Majandra?
I did.
Great.
Thank you so much for the question, and thank you for accommodating my presence despite the distance and the visa woes. No, thank you for that question. And this is something that we grapple with at FRIDA as well. Really centering the importance of compensating people for their work, and also recognizing the reality that oftentimes activists are not compensated for the work that they do, and they are also in contexts that are economically precarious. They hold oftentimes informal jobs or multiple jobs at once, short-term jobs, and as funders who oftentimes rely on the work of activists, it's important to not essentially worsen those conditions or perpetuate them, but to rather change those conditions and to ensure that activists are able to carry out their work in full safety, and safety understood holistically. Economic safety as well as safety in the context of risks and threats and harassment, to which resources are oftentimes needed in order to be safe and to keep ourselves safe. So for us, concretely, this is about compensating, for example, the advisors that we work with. FRIDA, as a young feminist fund that is participatory in nature, we don't make decisions as to where grants go ourselves, but rather we have a participatory grant-making system where grantee partners or activist collectives who apply decide where the funds go, and we also rely on a global network of young feminist activists who support us in the final decision-making process. And we are currently in the process of ensuring that all of these advisors are adequately compensated for the work that they do. And we also ensure to have MOUs or memorandums of understanding with those that we reach out to for knowledge sharing and information. And as a young feminist fund ourselves with a participatory grant-making system, which is quite unconventional, we do get reached out by other organizations who wish to learn from the way that we operate. And we have also learned along the way that it's important for us to also ask these organizations who reach out to us to sign memorandums of understanding with us as well, just to ensure that our work and our expertise is also recognized and acknowledged and compensated if that is relevant. So I think it's not easy, but it's about questioning sort of all the different people that we are relying upon to operate as an organization, and to really question who is being compensated and at what levels, and to ensure that we are not perpetuating any conditions of economic precariousness for activists.
Great, thank you, Majandra. So we had a question from Hitan Shah next to the pillar. Did someone get a mic to him? And then I'll move forwards here to Catherine Knox.
So I'm Hitan Shah, I'm chair of the Friends Provident Foundation. Thank you to all of the panel. The Friends Provident Foundation is campaigning for a more just and sustainable economy, and so all of the things we've talked about really resonate with the work that we do. The issue that we face as trustees is always the choices. You know, we have a limited amount of money that we're giving away each year, or working with our endowment. Where do we put the effort, as it were, in dealing with the kind of systemic issue? And so I'd like just a bit of guidance from each panelist to say, if you had to prioritize, and I realize it's hard because you're going to say it's systemic and we have to do everything, but you know, as trustees, we have to make a choice every day. Okay, we've got X million pounds, we're going to put it here or here or here. You know, do we put it into movement building? Do we put it into policy change? Do we put it into technology? You know, where are the sources of change which will lead us? Where's the best pathway? Thank you.
Thanks, and I think I'll just take one more question actually before we get the answers to that. So I'd sort this hand up here, Catherine Knox, and then we'll move on. It's up here at the front in a grey, in the middle aisle. Yeah, there, thank you.
Hello, it sort of follows on from the last question. Yes, hello, Catherine Knox, currently working at JRCT. I wanted to ask about the question about movement building. You know, there is a kind of issue about how radical funders will be, and I'd like to hear what you think funders could be doing in that space.
Great, I mean, those are quite connected. So who would like to go first? Majandra, shall I give you the first opportunity?
Sure. I'm sorry, the audio cut out a bit and I couldn't hear the second question. Would it be possible to summarize it?
Yes, it was around how to support movement building, so very connected to the first question.
Sure. Yes. Thank you so much for both of those questions, and I'm sure that many people in the room perhaps have similar questions to that. I would say, so for us, supporting movements is about core flexible funding. It is about ensuring that as a fund, we take on the most burden that we can with regards to reporting and monitoring and sort of the bureaucratic work, and ensuring that movements and activists can dedicate 100% or as much of their energy and time as possible to the vital work that they need to be doing, and not spending that time working on reporting and compiling receipts and filling in timesheets in a way that takes away from vitally needed time and energy and efforts to really strengthen movements. So it's about figuring out the internal systems to absorb that work and to make space for movements to really take leadership positions and be essentially dedicating their time to their movements directly and not to responding to our needs and our requests as a funder. And I mentioned the participatory grant-making system as well. There are multiple ways in which this can happen. Global Green Grants Fund also has a participatory system made up of advisory boards throughout the world that are made up of local activists themselves. That is one mechanism. I briefly described FRIDA's system of applicants themselves participating in the selection and decision making of where funds go. There are many ways in which participatory grant making can take place, but what is important is the principle of stepping back as a funder and recognizing that movements are experts, as I was mentioning in the video, are experts of their own reality. And they know best what they need, and they know best what is most useful for their movements to really affect the change that they seek to make. So that's generally about the participatory grant making and how best to support movements. I think there is no single solution, but what is important are the principles that should guide movement building work. In terms of what is best to support, yes, as you mentioned, it is a systemic issue, and therefore the way that I like to see it is that means that there is a multiplicity of responses, that there is no silver bullet, and actually that the mindset that leads us to think that there can be a silver bullet is reflective of a system that has led us to this problem in the first place. We need holistic, complex thinking that is intersectional, that recognizes that silos where climate change is on one side and, I don't know, human rights are on the other, are not helping us to find an integral, holistic solution and a deeply systemic solution to this deeply systemic crisis. And what that means is that there are many entry points, and that I think it really depends on the expertise of each organization and where each organization feels that they can make the most impact based on that expertise, based on that capacity, based on their geographical location, based on the resources that they have at hand. For FRIDA, the Young Feminist Fund, that means having a participatory system to support young feminist activists who are leading movements around the world. We do not engage directly in policy work, because that is not our area of expertise, but that may well be your area of expertise, and we need that. We need policy work, we need direct support, we need movement building, we need all of this. And all of this also in a context of recognizing that movements are drastically underfunding. Like I was mentioning, 3% of environmental grants are going to the grassroots. So there is a question of a vital need of movements for more resources. Movements are severely underfunded, and they are putting their lives on the line, and they are risking their survival every single day, confronting extractive industries, fossil fuel companies, every single day, and being murdered and being persecuted for this every single day. And it is our responsibility, I believe, to highlight their voices and to support them and to keep them safe.
Thank you, Majandra.
And that requires resources.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Miatta.
So if I sort of take those two very good questions together, I think the first thing I'd say is that I think the key thing is funding needs to be coordinated, it needs to be pooled, it needs to be strategic across funders. And I think the philanthropic community and philanthropic funders need to be greater than the sum of their parts. So your point about there is limited funds, but actually if we pool and we work strategically, I think that's part of the battle. Now, our view at NEF is that the kind of change that we're talking about requires change at the top and change on the ground. So it is partly about policy change, imagining an alternative to the current that we have, and figuring out how we get from here to how we get from there. That has to be part of the equation, because a lot of the thinking about how we begin to shift the system hasn't been done, and it has to be done. But change at the top, I'm now convinced, is not going to happen unless you've got a movement on the ground that is pushing and trying to drive that change. Our politics will not respond unless there is political pressure on the ground for that change. So movement building is absolutely critical. Climate change is an amazing exemplar. There have been organizations that have been chipping away, and for the last decade, our politicians have put climate change secondary to everything else, including Brexit. And actually, it took students going on the streets and protesting. It took Extinction Rebellion. It took activism, grassroots activism, to propel it up the political agenda and start shifting the public debate. So we've seen the power of movements when they are mobilized. So I think it has to be dual. We've got to help shift the Overton window, because the change that we require is absolutely fundamental and requires us to reimagine how we do the day-to-day. But we're not going to get there. Political will be a big part of this unless we can galvanize the movement on the ground, which sort of takes to the question about movement building. I think the first thing I'd say is that funders cannot create movements. They are organic. It's already happening on the ground. I think the thing that funders can do is nurture, support, facilitate. And that's in part about flexible funding that funds backbone organizations, the people that are on the ground, organizing people, galvanizing them, allowing them to see that their fight, their struggle, is the same struggle that connects them. And, you know, the funding model at the moment, quite frankly, forces competition amongst organizations that you need to be collaborating on the ground for this stuff to happen. So a funding model that says, this is the change that we need to create, and actually, can we fund organizations collectively? Can we fund flexibly across organizations to try and deliver that outcome? That's a shift in the funding model, but that will incentivize and drive the sort of collaboration that you need if you're going to get backbone organizations that are battling lots of different challenges, are, you know, struggling with their just very survival, to be the catalyst that we need to see on the ground. And so I think my the big plea is, it is about a different funding model. It is about thinking about the bigger change, thinking about the outcomes, and thinking about how you can use that to incentivize, to support collaboration, how you can use that to enable people to essentially galvanize. The energy is there, the stuff is happening, the organizing happening. It's the funding to facilitate that I think we need.
Great. Kumi.
Thank you. Let me fully endorse the comments that Majandra and Miatta made first, and then give you two frames. Okay, so I'm going to be using my hands to answer this question, okay? So if you can answer the question, how does change happen? You can think about three layers: macro, meso, micro. By macro, I'm referring in this context to governance change, meso, policy change, and micro, the delivery of services, projects, and programs. Then if you can see another column of how long it takes to achieve success, you'll find that to deliver projects at a micro level, you can actually start, execute, and deliver within 1 year or little more. On policy changes, if you get lucky at the national level, you can get a change within 2 or 3 years, but you know that that's a much more longer time frame. And then when you look at governance change, like for example, changing the system of apartheid, you're talking about a much longer period. But then if you go to the last column, where you talk about where the investment in philanthropy is right now, you've got about 85% in service delivery at the micro level, about 10% at the meso level, and maybe, if you're lucky, 5% at the governance level. So with all our philanthropic work, not only with climate interventions, I would argue that we need to shift more resources into policy change work and into governance change work. And I think that unless we do that, we are not fulfilling the full ambition of philanthropy. But on the question of movement specifically and where money should be going, let me come at this at a slightly different angle and say that I think one of the mistakes that activism and social change agents have made over time, and I've made it as well, is that we assume that governments and those with power control us mainly through the deployment of what you could call the repressive state apparatus. You know, army, police, use of formal laws, and so on. And it is true that a lot of the defining of the political space in many countries is defined by the repressive state apparatus. However, I think that the more insidious and more powerful form of control is in fact what you could call the ideological state apparatus. That is the framework for education, the framework for religion, and most critically, the framework for the media. And the media environment today has become a major source of holding back progress and meaningful public discussion for multiple reasons, right? In the way that the media environment today does not give us media diversity. It's controlled by a handful of powerful people around the world. And so one of the things that I want to add to what has been said, investing in initiatives that grows global public awareness, understanding, and consciousness. By the way, the first point in the charter that was presented here for your intervention, which is raise, educate, and deepen understanding. I think don't underestimate the power of actually making creative investments in serious mass-scale public awareness raising, because if you did that, you create a fertile environment for social movements, public mobilization, and so on, because quite frankly, people are ahead of the leaders right now on the issue of climate. Thank you.
Great. So we had a question here. Howie, do you still have a question? Great. And then I'll move on to this gentleman in the pale shirt.
Thanks very much. Howard Frumkin from the Wellcome Trust. Thanks to all three speakers for fantastic interventions. Each of you is a systems thinker, emphasizing the need for cross-cutting holistic solutions to a complex problem. In that spirit, I'd like to ask you about one sector that hasn't been mentioned very much, which is the health sector. What would your advice be to the health sector, and in the context of this meeting, to health funders, about how best to attack climate change in the context of the broad changes that we need?
Thank you.
Hi, Seb Ellsworth from Access, the Foundation for Social Investment. Thank you very much for your interventions. I want to build on this theme about reforming funding practice that you're talking about, and both in terms of perhaps reallocating resources more to some of the movement building and policy and governance work, but also some of what you've talked about in terms of making funding simpler, reducing burdens, and so on. And I'm thinking about the implications of that in terms of the relationship that foundations have with civil society more broadly and the charities and social enterprises that we already support and already have a relationship with. And I guess part of the implication of that transition of resources may be that some of the programmatic funding in organisations that we have traditionally worked with, the funding of revenue, for example, might change. And I suppose I'm interested in the opportunities perhaps that a Green New Deal might have in terms of the civil society organisations we are already supporting and already, I'm sure, part of the solution. How does their business model change in this landscape to ensure that if we were to allocate more resources into some of the macro issues, they're still able to thrive in this context?
Thank you. Do you want to take that first, Miatta?
Yeah, really, really good question. I mean, I think I'd say sort of two things. I think the first is that it will drive a shift from projects and initiatives that alleviate, and these are important because we do face huge societal and social justice pressures, but trying to think about how you pivot onto things that drive longer term change. And that will require lots of kind of partners to work slightly differently, but it'll also require them to see themselves as part of a movement, and to see themselves as not trying to deal with just an atomized issue, but thinking about how it cuts across and who else, you know, within a place, for example, which I think is a really powerful locus for some of this work. So funding, I think, if you fund the Green New Deal and say, well, look, these are the outcomes we need to change, and that means quite fundamental change in communities, some that will be hugely impacted by the transition. We can't underestimate the potential social justice cost if we don't get this right. Imagine if you were funding a collaboration of organizations in a place, say, that were all trying to think about their role and actually the work they do trying to help that long-term transition. That becomes quite powerful, and I think that becomes quite catalytic. So I think there's there will be a challenge around shifting the business model, but if the funding changes, I think the appetite to shift the business model will be there. I think the second is, lots of organizations are leaders in their community. They are movement leaders, and the space for them to do that, the space for them to think about not just trying to deliver a particular project that deals with the here or now, but taking their community along with them and making people create those dots for longer term change, I think is really, really powerful. So, my big message in all of this is, we cannot get anywhere close to cracking this thing unless we all work really differently. We cannot get close to cracking it unless we collaborate, because there are not enough of us and the scale of the problem is too big. And yes, dealing with the here and now and the urgent is important, but the long term is going to become very, very urgent, and it is going to be absolutely fundamental to everything. So we need to start shifting how we work. And I think funders and how you work could be absolutely catalytic to that change.
Thanks. I would endorse that as a response to your question, and I'll pick up the health question if I may. Thank you so much for raising this. I think that we must concede that one of the catastrophic errors we made in 1992, when the first Rio Earth Summit happened, when the world acknowledged that climate change was a major threat that needed to be addressed, that we allowed the issue of climate change to be framed primarily as an environmental issue, when in fact, and now you can see the cross-cutting nature of it. And I believe that having a strong narrative around climate and health is critically important right now to actually provide solutions to how climate change is already exacerbating certain health challenges that we've had, reintroducing certain health problems that we thought we've dealt with, and so on. So if you take a country like China, which is a critical part of the solution, China, I would argue, last night I was having a strategy discussion with some of my colleagues on how we support things positively in China. And one of the major entry points in a country like China, or potentially India eventually, we're not there yet, is in fact through the health implications of carbon pollution, right? That's become a major narrative. The Chinese authorities know that if they do not address the question of how people are feeling about their health impacts, it's going to be difficult for them politically. Let me just also say that when we're talking about climate impacts, we're talking about water scarcity, right? So the fact that already a lot of people don't have access to clean drinking water, and that's an issue. So if you look at the specific impacts, it's clear. And the good news is, in 2011, at the climate negotiations in Durban, that's where it was that year, which, by the way, is the city I come from, what happened is we had a side meeting to start this process, and there is a movement now of health folks and climate folks working together, and I'm happy to connect you to them if that's helpful. Thank you.
Super, thank you. I think I'll move on to the next question, if that's all right with you, Majandra, just to get as many questions in as possible. I see a hand at the front here with the lady in the fourth row back. Thank you. And then there's a hand at the back in a black top.
Is it just working? Jessica Prendergast. I'm a trustee of Power to Change, but I'm also kind of an imposter. So the reason I'm a trustee of Power to Change is that I am a community activist, and I work on the ground in communities doing place-based work, tackling some of this kind of social, economic injustice on the ground. I think it's really, really hugely encouraging to hear that we're moving from a conversation about sticking plasters on a broken economic system into one where we're talking about how we replace that system so that it stops causing so many wounds that need plasters. But inevitably that's all about power and agency. And so I want to ask the question about how we, as the agents of change on the ground who are doing some of this big thinking as well as the service delivery, how we be brave enough to challenge funders to start really listening to what's happening there, and whether and how we help foundations and funders to really actually be brave enough to really listen.
Thank you. There was a question at the back. You can see a finger waving with a black top. Majandra, did you hear that question? Great.
Hi, Duncan Chopsole from Lloyds Bank Foundation for England and Wales. It's a little reflection, then a question. The first is, I loved all 4 speeches. I thought they were amazing. And I particularly like Carol and the fact that ACF is setting a lead in this area. And I think that's a welcome change. Sometimes ACF has taken the view it sort of needs to follow and move at the pace of its slowest members, and actually leading is great. So I think that's great. But, thank you. For ACF. I've got a slight disquiet because I'm also sitting here thinking, my God, couldn't we have had some leadership on some other issues like poverty or benefits or the immigration system which stops our speaker coming here, or even say Brexit. And I suppose that's my concern, which is we are a revenue funder, we're not endowed. I completely get the disinvestment story, I completely get the do no harm, but we also face in the UK a crisis of mental health, of community funding, of the benefit system, of immigration. And as revenue funders, every pound we put on the climate issue, even though we're a funder who does influencing, we don't put into tackling those issues. And I know the answer is it's all interlinked, and a social justice issue is an environment issue. But day in, day out as funders, how do we tie that to the crises that we face in the communities that we fund, with the people that we fund? Because it is about choices. And also, I completely also get you as speakers, but we know from where Extinction Rebellion was on the streets and how it went down when they went to Shadwell and when they went to Canning Town. How do we reconcile us as funders wanting to help communities who aren't currently, their number one issue isn't the climate crisis, their number one issue is putting food on the table? Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan. So I think those are 2 quite interlinked questions about going to root causes. So, Majandra, did you want to take those first? Did you hear them properly? Great.
I did. I think I did. I'm having a few technical issues, but yeah, no, thank you for those questions. And I would say, with regards to the first question, it's important to keep having these spaces, to keep having these conversations, to keep having this strong leadership, to make sure that we're sharing our stories, our challenges, I think the deep existential questions that it brings up too, of what our mission and purpose is in this time of crisis, and how this crisis impacts that and in what ways. And to keep collaborating. To me, that's sort of the number one task at hand is, there were numbers shared at the beginning of the day around collectively holding over 50 billion UK pounds and giving, I believe, over 2 billion annually. That is huge. That is so huge. I cannot, I think it's really important to move from a scarcity mindset of thinking that the problem is too big, of feeling paralysis and overwhelmed, which Kumi referred to as well in his intervention, to really focusing on the abundance that we have at hand, and the wealth of solutions, and the wealth of alternatives, and the wealth of movements who, again, are risking everything to fight for what they love. Yes, we feel fear, and there are feelings of grief and of sorrow, but I think in terms of what moves us to act, it's about love. It's about love for our planet, love for our communities, love for our families, love for life itself, right? For human life on Earth. And that's something that's important to not lose sight of in terms of moving from a scarcity perspective, dominated by competition and fear and individualistic mindsets, to one of abundance and collaboration. And in terms of the dire needs that the communities that we work with are facing, I would say, and at FRIDA we work primarily with young feminist and trans activists. And for example, we're seeing trans youth in the Pacific telling us that when a natural disaster comes and flooding leads to them being displaced for their homes, the government-run safe houses are places where they get sexually assaulted and harassed. They are not safe for them. And in the United States, I believe the number is up to as high as 80% of those living on the streets and houseless today are LGBTQI people whose homes are no longer safe for them. And those are the people who are primarily impacted and displaced when a natural disaster happens. And we saw this in the recent natural disasters that happened in the United States. And so I think it's about seeing how those highly vulnerable populations living in poverty, trans and LGBTI populations, for example, are being disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, and how any support that we give to these communities needs to take on a climate lens in this moment of crisis.
Thank you.
Again, two really good questions and, related. So the sort of Jess's point about activists and community organizers on the ground and being a really powerful voice for the change. And I think there's something really, powerful, to use the phrase again, in that. And some of the work that we are doing is to try and build community organizers, partly to, yes, speak to funders, but also to be the advocates of the change that we're talking about. And actually, it's not just about the hard graft of organizing people on the ground, but actually the work of trying to come up with different ways of doing things and mobilize communities around different ways of doing things. There is real value and power in that needs to be translated to the national level. So, when going back to Hitan's question, is it about change at the top or change at the bottom? It is both, but actually the change at the top should be driven by the work and the experience and the knowledge that it's been galvanized from the ground. And the thing that we're trying to do at the New Economics Foundation, for example, is to say, well, take an issue like the Green New Deal. Actually, the policy prospectus shouldn't just be developed by smart people in an ivory tower somewhere. It should be developed in collaboration with people who are on the ground trying to make this stuff happen. It should be developed with the activists that have the knowledge and experience of what this change looks like, and we should use that to help inform our view of policy so the two sit hand and foot. So I think there's a really powerful job, but that requires us to build the capacity of community builders. That requires us to build the capacity of movement leaders, and that goes back to the question about how you fund and what you fund. The really important point made by Duncan, that's the perennial issue. There are just urgent pressing issues that are day to day, putting food on people's table versus what feels like a longer term issue. But, I think my argument is twofold. When climate change bites, it is going to blow all of this out the table. So that issue of families feeding themselves is suddenly going to go on steroids. So it is a long-term, but it's a social justice issue. It's not a climate issue. And then my second point is, they are related. And the thing that links them up is the economic system, which is a thing that we've been consistently kind of banging on about. And why we are excited by the Green New Deal is because actually it's brought together the environmental movement and the social justice movement and said, these are not two separate fights. They are one fight. They are fundamentally linked. And the economic system that is perpetuating the fact that people have to go to food banks, the fact that families can't feed their kids, is exactly the same economic system that is driving the climate emergency. You've got to crack that if you want to crack the problem, because otherwise all we're doing is alleviating and mitigating a tanker that is going over the edge. So I think you've got to bring the two together. And then the day-to-day, it's hard, but it's about thinking about social justice interventions, your projects, and how you could do that in ways that try to drive, mitigate, improve the environmental piece, but also thinking about the environmental piece in the lens of how do we drive social justice. So, we have to have the transition. And if we're doing that, well, how are we doing it in a way that works for communities? How are we doing it in a way that invests power and control in the economy in the hands of people, which is why we talk about things like community and collective ownership. Who does the economy work for? How do we ensure that people exert power and control over it? But it's also thinking about, well, what is the role of the well-being state, right? How do we move from a model where the thing that we're pursuing is growth, but the growth that doesn't benefit people, to a model where actually the ultimate goal is people's well-being? And that requires us to fundamentally rethink how our institutions work at the national level and the local level. But that is the job at hand. And unless we crack that, we neither crack the social justice problem, nor do we crack the environmental justice problem. So we've got to go back to the economic system.
Again, I'd fully endorse Majandra and Miatta's comments. Just to add 2 brief points. One, I don't know about the history of ACF, but I just wanted to also share what Duncan, I think, said. I was very impressed with the leadership that I saw in this opening plenary coming from the leadership of ACF, because that's exactly the kind of leadership that we need. But also, I was also very impressed with the fact that that charter of activities put there comes from members' input that shaped it. So I think you've got a good top-down and bottom-up sort of thing happening here. So I think at a minimum, right, what all foundations and trusts should be doing is looking at climatizing their work. Let me say what I mean by that. So if you're working on youth development, look at what are the youth-specific implications for young people in terms of how the climate crisis is going to intersect. If you're looking at urban development or rural development issues, clearly you can see how you can actually climatize that. Even if you take an issue like gender equality, and it's not often that I quote, say the sentence that I'm about to say, I strongly agree with the CIA and the Pentagon when in 2002 they presented a report to George W. Bush which said that in the coming decades the biggest threat to peace, security and stability will not come from conventional threats but actually will come from the impacts of climate change. And we know that when there is war and conflict, women and children suffer the most in terms of impacts. So even if you are a foundation working just primarily on gender equality, you can bring in the sort of genderized climate analysis to it. The one thing that's the elephant in the room here in these conversations that's very hard to answer, tackle, just briefly, is one is the issue of what the history teaches us about the power of civil disobedience, right? Which was related to one of the first questions about supporting social movements that are engaging. If history teaches us anything, when humanity has faced a major injustice or a major challenge, whether it was slavery, colonialism, or women's right to vote, apartheid in South Africa, civil rights in the US, and many more struggles, those struggles only move forward when decent women and men stood up and said, enough is enough and no more. We're prepared to put our lives on the line if necessary. We're prepared to go to prison if necessary. And that is something that we have to support right now. But doing that doesn't mean we should assume that everybody at a community level or at any level are all going to be open to the idea of civil disobedience. We also have to have other pathways of participation. The IPCC, for example, when they gave us 12 years in October last year to get emissions to peak and start coming down, in that report they said one part of the solution is planting 1 trillion trees. If Ethiopia, a poor country, in 12 hours can plant 293 million trees because they had political will to do it, why can't, as a global community, we cannot actually start moving in the direction of that one contributing problem? The consumption issue, which is, the word consumption has not been used in this conversation, but it is the elephant in the room. And I want to say that we have far too unequal consumption, and there are some people consuming immorally at high levels and a majority that are consuming to a point. And I would just end by saying that we should actually recognize that today one of the biggest challenges that we face, almost one of the biggest illnesses we face, it's not influenza, but it's a disease we could call affluenza, right? It's a pathological illness where people in the world are being led to believe that a good, decent, happy, meaningful life comes primarily from more and more and more and more material acquisitions. And unless we insert those kinds of conversations into our solutions, I think our solutions will be half-baked, inadequate, and will not avert the climate crisis that we are facing right now, getting much worse than it is already.
Thank you. Thank you all. So that brings us close to the end of our session. What I've been hearing from all three of you, and you complemented each other really, really well, was this sort of call to arms to funders to do things really quite differently from the status quo, to start weaving the climate crisis into your work. We've heard about systemic change to address the root causes of climate change and inequality, poverty, health issues. And as Miatta put it so clearly, it's the economy that links all of those issues. The economy is currently not serving either the majority of people or nature. And that can look like various things. I mean, planting trees, as you just mentioned, but also the systemic sort of policy level change. And it can also be supporting movements to raise up their voices, as many funders are beginning to do. And we heard from Majandra, centering communities in philanthropic decision-making is crucial, so that the people who are most affected by climate change are the ones who are empowered to make the decisions about how we address it. And then finally, at the very beginning, Kumi touched on this idea of a dream versus a nightmare and the need for hope. And you will all have heard Greta Thunberg speaking. She's very good at being very direct. And what she said, though I will paraphrase it, is the only form of hope is action. You cannot have hope without action. So I'm looking forward to seeing what funders start to do differently and continue to do as a result of today. So I have a few things to ask you to do just before I thank the panel. First of all, could you rate the plenary on your app? That would be helpful to get your feedback. In a moment, we're going to do a final question with your digi-voting box. But before that, so I don't forget, I just want to remind you about the funder commitment on climate change. There's a lunchtime briefing on that at 12:45. That's going to be in the Anderson room, right next to where lunch is being served, so you can't miss it. And then there'll be a workshop on it on the 18th of November that you can sign up for on the ACF website to better understand what the commitment requires and to find out how you might be supported to make it. So if, Alistair, we could have that final question, that would be very helpful. So if you could start voting on what action you think you might take on the climate crisis. Great. If we could see the results from that, please, Alistair. So over a quarter of you are going to take it to your board to discuss. Another quarter are going to talk about it in meetings, which presumably has already happened to a certain extent based on the results we had earlier. I think that's really quite encouraging, and I really look forward to conversations with all of you throughout the day about the specifics of what you're hoping to do, especially at the meeting on the funder commitment, because we'll be talking through investments versus grant making and so on at that meeting. So thank you very much, and a huge thanks to our excellent speakers and to Majandra, who's still listening.